The Janissaries. In the Ottoman Empire, from the late 1300s to 1826, a military force emerged that would terrify every enemy nation they faced. The Janissaries began as an elite corps formed through the devshirme system, a practice where Christian boys from the Balkans were conscripted, converted to Islam, and trained as soldiers of the Sultan. It was a brutal system, but it worked. These boys, ripped from their families and forged into warriors, developed absolute loyalty to the Sultan alone. Between the 14th and 19th centuries, the Janissaries became perhaps the most formidable fighting force the world had ever encountered. They were professional soldiers in an age of militias. They trained relentlessly. They fought with precision and discipline. In battle or siege, they would wait for the frontline troops to break through enemy defenses, then swarm in with bows and muskets, showing no mercy to anyone who stood against them. Their tactics proved devastatingly effective during the siege of Constantinople in 1453, where their musketry helped breach the city's legendary walls, and they defeated the Egyptian Mamluks in 1467, expanding Ottoman power across the Mediterranean. But success bred arrogance and corruption. The Janissaries became more than soldiers. They became kingmakers, power brokers who controlled the fate of sultans. They weren't content to serve. They wanted to rule. From the reign of Bayezid II onward, they regularly demanded extra pay for their loyalty, essentially holding the empire hostage to their ambitions. Their maintenance costs soared to unsustainable levels. Their corruption festered throughout the military. They assassinated sultans who displeased them. They executed reformers who threatened their power. By the time Osman II tried to discipline them and cut their pay, he was signing his own death warrant. They executed him without hesitation and installed a new sultan more to their liking. They had become untouchable, or so they thought. In 1826, Sultan Mahmud II finally decided the Janissaries had to go, that the empire could no longer survive with such a dangerous power within it. In what became known as the Auspicious Incident, the Sultan orchestrated a brilliant and coordinated rebellion, turning the common people against the now hated guard, and in a single day of coordinated violence that shocked the world, 6,000 or more Janissaries were hunted down and executed throughout Constantinople and its surroundings. The force that had terrified the world for centuries was eliminated in hours. The barracks that housed them were demolished stone by stone, erased from the landscape. Their history was rewritten to minimize their importance and achievements. The Janissaries vanished, not because they weakened or lost their fighting spirit, but because they had become too dangerous to keep alive. The Praetorian Guard. In ancient Rome, the emperor needed protection. So Augustus, the first emperor, created the Praetorian Guard in 27 BCE as his personal security force. What began as a personal security detail would become the most powerful and dangerous military force within the empire itself, more influential than the Senate, more feared than the legions. By 23 CE, the Praetorians were stationed in walled barracks near the heart of Rome, a fortress within the capital, and for 300 years they would murder emperors, auction off the throne, destabilize succession, and reshape the course of civilization. The Praetorians received far better pay than regular soldiers, the sesquiplex stipendum or pay-and-a-half system, with some emperors increasing their salaries to 1,500 denarii per year, paid in installments throughout the year. But money wasn't their only source of power, or even their primary source. They controlled access to the emperor. They could allow visitors or refuse them. They controlled succession through their support or withdrawal of support. They held the future of Rome literally in their hands. Their influence over imperial politics was absolute and corrupting. A Praetorian prefect could bring down an emperor or elevate a new one with a single word. They weren't shy about using this power. The most shocking display of their power came in 193 CE, when they decided to auction off the imperial throne itself to the highest bidder willing to pay their price. Senator Didius Julianus offered each praetorian an enormous sum, 25,000 sestertii, roughly 5 years of regular soldier pay for one man. And the praetorians agreed unanimously, making Didius emperor for a price. He lasted exactly 66 days before being assassinated by someone else with more resources. For centuries, the Senate was weakened by praetorian interference. The army was weakened by their constant demands. Only the praetorians remained strong and grew stronger. They had become the kingmakers, the real rulers of Rome, hidden behind marble walls and the fiction of imperial authority. By the time Constantine defeated Maxentius in 312 CE, the emperor realized what Augustus never could. The guard had to be destroyed completely. Constantine disbanded the remaining praetorians and scattered them across the empire to harmless postings. The Castra Praetoria was dismantled, its very stones removed and scattered. An age of Rome ended. The unit that had shaped history was erased, relegated to forgotten inscriptions and scattered historical records that few bothered to read. The Waffen-SS. Hitler's elite army began small, barely 28,000 men at the start of World War II. By 1945, it had swollen to over 500,000 soldiers, spread across dozens of divisions. The Waffen-SS, the military branch of the SS, evolved from a Praetorian Guard into a massive combat force that participated in most major campaigns of the war, from France to the Soviet Union to the Balkans. Initially, membership was restricted to those of Germanic ancestry, supposedly racially pure, though the rules were relaxed in 1940 as expansion became necessary. After the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, units of foreign volunteers and conscripts were formed, drawing men from occupied Europe and even from nations that hadn't been conquered. They were trained in assault tactics, mobile warfare, shock tactics designed to break through enemy defenses. Their role was to be the force that maintained Nazi order across conquered territories, acting as shock troops and enforcers of Nazi ideology. They were expected to prove themselves in blood at the front, and many did, fighting with fanatical devotion to Hitler. For a time, they were effective, brutal, and feared by enemies who had learned to dread their arrival. But as the Waffen-SS grew in size, it lost its elite status and discipline. By 1943, it was no longer the carefully selected force it had once been. It was a massive conscript army stained by countless atrocities, committed in the name of Nazi supremacy. The Waffen-SS was declared a criminal organization by the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg in 1946, condemned for its role in the Holocaust, for systematic war crimes, for documented crimes against civilians, including massacres and deportations. Estimates suggest around 180,000 Waffen-SS soldiers were killed in action, 70,000 missing in action, 400,000 wounded in the fighting. After defeat in 1945, the Waffen-SS ceased to exist as an organization. Its members were hunted down across Europe, tried, convicted, and imprisoned in the years following the war. The unit that was meant to rule Europe was disbanded and dismantled, its legacy defined not by military prowess, but by industrial-scale horror. The German stormtroopers. In the spring of 1915, during the grinding stalemate of World War I, German commanders created something revolutionary in response to the deadlock of trench warfare. They formed the first assault units, called the Stoßtruppen or stormtroopers, hand-picked men heavily armed and specially trained for close combat in the chaos of trench assault. Major Calso founded the program, but Captain Willy Rohr perfected their tactics and doctrine. The methods were based on traditional Prussian infiltration tactics, but evolved into something entirely new and more lethal. These weren't ordinary soldiers conscripted from civilian life. They were volunteers, the best of the best, carefully selected and intensively trained. They were equipped with satchels full of grenades, making each man a walking arsenal capable of independent action. They carried rifles, pistols, and trench knives, They moved in small, coordinated squads supported by heavy machine guns and field artillery. They struck where defenses were weakest, slipping through gaps in enemy lines, rolling up trenches from inside, moving like a fluid strike force. The stormtroopers were celebrated in the German press as the finest soldiers in the world. They received better rations, more comfortable billets, and far more rest than regular troops. They didn't man trenches like ordinary soldiers, living in mud and filth. They were brought to the front just before action and withdrawn after it was complete. They traveled by truck to preserve their strength for combat. From the beginning, they were treated as the elite of the German army, and they knew it, wore it proudly. The stormtroopers pioneered assault tactics that would influence military doctrine for decades to come. They demonstrated conclusively that speed, surprise, and concentrated force could break through even well-defended positions. In October 1915, they successfully attacked a French position in the Vosges Mountains. They proved their effectiveness again and again at the front. But as the war continued, the fundamental problems became clear to German command. You couldn't train an entire army of stormtroopers. The quality declined with expansion. The standards had to be lowered to meet demand. By 1918, only 56 of 192 divisions could employ infiltration tactics effectively. The stormtroopers had been too elite to scale up to an entire army. After the war, the unit was disbanded, scattered into history and memory. But their tactical innovations lived on, influencing how every modern army conducts warfare and assault operations. The Mamluks. In the 9th century, Arab rulers throughout the Middle East began buying slave warriors from Central Asia and the Caucasus to serve as professional soldiers loyal only to their purchasers. These were the Mamluks, slave soldiers who would eventually rule empires and reshape the Islamic world forever. They were ethnically diverse. Turks, Circassians, Mongols, Greeks, trained from youth in military skills through brutal academies designed to break their spirits and rebuild them as warriors, and were theoretically loyal because they owed everything to their masters who had purchased them. But as centuries passed, the Mamluks became so skilled, so organized, and so powerful that they stopped serving their masters and began serving themselves and their own interests. By the mid-13th century, the Mamluks had seized control of Egypt through a military coup. They established the Mamluk Sultanate and ruled from 1250 to 1517, presiding over Egypt and Syria and controlling vital Mediterranean trade routes. They defeated the Mongols decisively at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, one of the most important military victories in history that saved the Islamic world from Mongol conquest. The Mamluks created a military caste system where rank and power could be earned through skill and merit. It was meritocratic in a way few societies were in that era. Former slaves could become generals, governors, emirs, and even sultans through demonstrated ability. But this system had inherent weaknesses. Every generation of Mamluks had to be replenished through continuous slave acquisition from foreign lands. This created instability. Rival factions fought for control of the Sultanate. Corruption crept deeper into the system over centuries. By the late 18th century, the Mamluk system had decayed significantly, weakened by internal conflicts and external threats. In 1517, Ottoman ruler Muhammad Ali overran Egypt and ended the Mamluks' independent reign through military conquest. The Sultanate that had stood for nearly 3 centuries collapsed under the weight of Ottoman power. Some Mamluks were executed by the new rulers. Others were absorbed into the Ottoman military system. The institution of military slavery that had produced one of history's most effective military classes faded into the past, replaced by new systems. The Mamluks left behind a legacy of architectural beauty, mathematical innovation, and military doctrine. But the force itself was gone, replaced by yet another elite guard system. The Varangian Guard. Around 988 CE, Byzantine Emperor Basil II received an unusual request from Vladimir I of Kievan Rus. Vladimir asked for military assistance to defend his throne against rivals and internal foes, and in exchange, he promised to convert to Christianity and provide elite warriors from his lands. Basil agreed to the arrangement and received 6,000 Norse and Slavic warriors. They became the Varangian Guard, an elite unit that would serve Byzantine emperors for the next 4 centuries as personal bodyguards and shock troops. The Varangians were recruited specifically because they had no political loyalties or family connections in Constantinople. They couldn't lead local revolts or conspiracies because they had no faction to support them. They were outsiders, foreigners, devoted only to the emperor's pay and the opportunity for plunder of conquered cities. The Varangians were renowned throughout the entire Mediterranean world for their combat skills and legendary ferocity in battle. Their signature weapon was the Dane axe, a long-handled, single-bladed weapon of Norse design that could reach over a meter in length and weighed enough to require both hands to wield effectively. The axe was capable of cleaving through shields, armor, and bone with devastating efficiency. It was a devastating close combat weapon in the right hands, and the Varangians perfected its use. They were versatile fighters, skilled with swords and bows, and some sources describe them as mounted warriors capable of fighting from horseback. They fought in Basil's brutal campaigns against the Bulgars, cutting down enemies by the thousands in the mountains of Bulgaria. By the 11th century, the composition of the Varangian Guard changed as demographics shifted. The supply of Norse warriors from Kievan Rus declined due to competing demands and Christian conversion spreading through Scandinavia. After the Norman conquest of England in 1066, many Anglo-Saxon exiles unwilling to serve William the Conqueror came to Constantinople seeking new lives and joined the Varangians. By the early 12th century, thousands of Anglo-Saxon warriors served as Varangians, bringing their own traditions of discipline, stoicism, and pride. They remained loyal and formidable warriors until the Byzantine Empire itself began to decline in power and influence. By the 14th century, their influence had waned significantly as the empire contracted. As Constantinople weakened under pressure from Ottoman expansion, the Varangian Guard faded into obscurity, their service ending not with a dramatic elimination, but with the slow erosion of the empire they protected and served. The Sacred Band of Thebes. In ancient Greece, the city-state of Thebes created perhaps the most unconventional elite military unit ever assembled in the ancient world. Around 378 BCE, a military leader named Gorgidas formed a unit of 150 pairs of male lovers, 300 men total, called the Sacred Band of Thebes. The theory behind this organization was simple and bold. Men who were lovers would fight more fiercely to protect each other than soldiers with no such emotional bond. That love itself was a weapon that multiplied courage and commitment. The unit was later refined and elevated by the legendary commander Pelopidas, who took the concept further and structured it into a formidable and devastating fighting force. The Sacred Band of Thebes became one of the most feared military forces in ancient Greece, spoken of with awe and fear by enemies throughout the Mediterranean world. In 371 BCE, they fought against the Spartans at the Battle of Leuctra. The Spartans were thought invincible by most Greeks. The Spartan phalanx was the gold standard of Greek warfare, a wall of shields and spears that had dominated for centuries. But the Sacred Band broke through them with devastating tactics and courage. The Spartans were routed, scattered, defeated in open battle. It was a stunning upset, a victory that shattered Sparta's reputation forever and ensured Thebes' emergence as a major power in Greece. For decades, the Sacred Band was considered unbeatable by any force. Soldiers feared them. Enemies retreated at their approach. Their bond, their rigorous training, their legendary courage made them stories told throughout the Greek world. But in 338 BCE, they met Philip II of Macedon at the Battle of Chaeronea, and everything changed. Philip had developed the Macedonian phalanx, a new military formation with longer spears that fundamentally changed warfare forever. The traditional hoplite infantry couldn't match this new formation. The Theban army broke and fled in panic. But the sacred band refused to surrender or retreat. Surrounded and overwhelmed by superior force, all 300 men held their ground and died fighting, standing beside their last commander, Theagenes, fighting to the last man. Every single member was killed in the battle. Their final stand became legendary, commemorated in art, literature, and mythology. Their existence spanned only 40 years, from 378 to 338 BCE. But in that relatively brief time, they changed Greek warfare forever and proved that unconventional bonds of love and loyalty could create extraordinary soldiers capable of superhuman feats. The Knights Templar. In 1118 CE, a military religious order called the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, known as the Knights Templar, was established to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land along dangerous routes. They wore distinctive white mantles with a red cross that became instantly recognizable across Christendom. They were based in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, in control of sacred and strategic territory. For nearly 2 centuries, they were among the most skilled and feared warriors of the Crusades, fighting with religious fervor and military discipline. The Knights Templar became wealthy through extensive land ownership across Europe and financial services that made them essential to rulers. They provided banking and credit transfers to popes and kings, essentially inventing modern banking practices. Their wealth stretched from Britain to Syria to the Levant. They financed military expeditions to recover the Holy Land. They built fortifications across the Mediterranean designed to control trade and military movement. One Muslim chronicler called them the fiercest fighters of all the Crusaders, and their reputation was thoroughly justified through centuries of combat. They fought with discipline and courage. They held castles against impossible odds using smaller numbers. They faced down armies far larger than their own and often prevailed, but their immense wealth and growing power made them dangerous targets for ambitious rulers. In 1307, French King Philip IV decided the Templars had to be destroyed and their wealth confiscated. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, at dawn, Philip orchestrated a coordinated mass arrest across France. Templars were seized simultaneously, imprisoned, and interrogated. The arrest warrant claimed God was displeased with them and their practices. Philip questioned whether they practiced heresy, obscene rituals, and forbidden magic during their secret ceremonies. Under torture, some Templars confessed to these charges. Whether the accusations were genuine or deliberately fabricated remains unclear even today. Philip was chronically short of money and desperately wanted the Templars' wealth. He also feared their power, their autonomy, and their loyalty to the Pope, rather than the king. In 1312, under pressure from Philip, Pope Clement V officially disbanded the order under ecclesiastical authority. Templar property was transferred to the Hospitallers, or confiscated by secular rulers. Templars were executed across Europe. The order that had lasted nearly 2 centuries was dismantled in months. Their headquarters in Jerusalem was lost. Their secrets, if they had any, were buried with them. The Persian Immortals. Around 500 BCE, the Great Persian Empire under Darius I created an elite military unit called the Immortals, or Anusia. They numbered exactly 10,000 men at full strength, and by strict protocol, when one died, a replacement was immediately recruited to maintain their sacred number. The Immortals were the personal guard of the Persian emperor and the nucleus of the Persian standing army. They were the most heavily armored soldiers of their age, wearing ornate scaled armor and carrying large shields. They wielded spears and bows with devastating accuracy that few of their enemies could match. The Immortals were selected from the most skilled soldiers in the empire and underwent rigorous training in warfare and loyalty. They were paid far better than regular troops, receiving special stipends. They received special rations and elite equipment. They were an elite within an elite, a force of legendary proportions spoken of with respect and fear. The Immortals fought in every major campaign of the Persian Empire's expansion. They stood against the Greeks at Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea during the Persian Wars. They accompanied Xerxes on his massive invasion of Greece. They were formidable opponents, disciplined, well-trained, and confident in their abilities. But at Plataea in 479 BCE, the Immortals were defeated in pitched battle against the Greek alliance. The Greek hoplite phalanx, supported by archers and cavalry, broke their formation and drove them back. The Immortals retreated, suffering heavy losses. The loss damaged Persian prestige and morale, but didn't destroy the unit permanently. The Immortals continued to serve for centuries afterward. They adapted to new forms of warfare. They learned from their defeats. They remained a core force of the Persian military through successive empires and dynasties. But as the Persian Empire fragmented and fell to Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE, the Immortals were absorbed into new armies or disbanded. Some merged with Macedonian forces, others scattered into history and obscurity. The Immortals weren't eliminated in a single dramatic event, but gradually dissolved as the empire that created them ceased to exist. Their legacy remained in accounts written by Greek historians and in the memory of their courage preserved in history. The Ottoman Sipahis. The Ottoman Empire relied on a military system centered on the Sipahis, cavalry landowners who provided mounted soldiers in exchange for land grants and elevated social position. Over time, an elite class of Sipahis emerged, the most skilled horsemen, the most heavily armed, the most feared and respected across the Mediterranean, Balkans, and Middle East. The Sipahis were instrumental in Ottoman victories across Europe, Asia, and Africa, expanding the empire relentlessly. They were trained from childhood in horsemanship and combat through a feudal military system. They wielded lances, swords, and bows with extraordinary skill developed over years of practice. In the 14th and 15th centuries, Sipahi cavalry dominated battlefields across the region. They were nearly invincible against disorganized European forces fighting medieval style. They helped conquer Constantinople and expand the empire at breathtaking pace across 3 continents. But as gunpowder weapons became increasingly prevalent in warfare, cavalry became less effective on the battlefield. By the 17th century, Sipahi cavalry was declining in military importance and relevance. The rise of musketeers and artillery rendered the traditional cavalry charge increasingly obsolete and suicidal. The Sipahis attempted to adapt to new weapons and tactics, but couldn't overcome the fundamental shift in military technology. Their power and prestige declined. By the 19th century, the Sipahi system was dismantled entirely. Land grants were revoked. Training programs ceased. The elite cavalry force that had terrified Europe was reduced to historical curiosity. The Sipahis vanished not through dramatic suppression or violent elimination, but through technological obsolescence and administrative reform, fading from military relevance. Conclusion. These 10 elite military units, scattered across centuries and continents, reveal a pattern that repeats throughout human history with remarkable consistency. Each of these forces began with a specific purpose, a military problem that needed solving. A ruler wanted protection from rivals, or conquest of enemies, or projection of power. An elite unit was created to solve that problem. Each became exceptionally effective at its role. Each became so powerful that it threatened the rulers who created it. And each was ultimately destroyed or disbanded, sometimes gradually over decades, sometimes catastrophically in hours. The Janissaries were executed en masse in hours. The Praetorian Guard was legally dissolved and scattered across the empire. The Waffen-SS was eradicated through military defeat and subsequent trials for crimes against humanity. The stormtroopers were disbanded after defeat in war. The Mamluks were overthrown by a new imperial power. The Varangian Guard faded as the empire weakened and fractured. The sacred band was annihilated in battle. The Knights Templar were arrested and eliminated through legal proceedings and military action. The Immortals dissolved with their empire. The Roman cohorts fell to invasion and decline. The Sipahis were rendered obsolete by technology. What ties these units together is not their martial prowess, though all were formidable and feared. What ties them together is that they all became too powerful to control by the authorities that created them. A military unit created to serve the state became a state unto itself. It gained political power independent of the ruler. It accumulated wealth outside the treasury. It commanded loyalty from soldiers that superseded loyalty to the crown. Once that transformation occurred, the elite force became a threat to the very authority it was meant to protect. Rulers understood that the unit had to be eliminated, not because it was weak, but because it was strong. Some forces were destroyed suddenly, like the Janissaries in a single day of calculated violence. Others were dismantled gradually through administrative reform and technological obsolescence. Some faded as the empires they served decayed and fell to invaders. But the underlying pattern is consistent across all of them. The most effective military units, given time and power, become the most dangerous forces. Accumulate influence and prestige. They demand more autonomy and resources. They develop their own interests separate from and sometimes opposed to the state. When that moment comes, when the ruler realizes that the guard has become a threat, the only solution is elimination. These 10 armies are reminders that military power, once concentrated in elite units, is nearly impossible to control or constrain. They terrified nations, commanded empires, and reshaped the course of history. And every single one of them disappeared, not despite their strength, but because of it. The tragedy of elite armies is the tragedy of all concentrated power. It eventually turns against its creators.